Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Against TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Rebecca Panovka. Rebecca, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Rebecca Panovka. I'm a writer and a co-editor and co-founder of a new magazine called The Drift.
Thanks so much for coming on today. So we're going to be talking about an essay that you published in Harper's recently, and the headline is Men in Dark Times, How Hannah Arendt's Fans Misread the Post-Truth Presidency. The link will be below. I thought it was really interesting. So thanks for coming on to talk about it. So why did you decide to write this piece? What was the origin of it?
The origin was I was happened to be in a grad seminar on Hannah Arendt during the 2016 election. And
the perfect place.
The perfect place. The day after, well, yeah, or not. The day after the 2016 election, I, literally had to get up and read a few chapters from The Origins of Totalitarianism, which I did not do. Kind of stumbled pretty groggy to my seminar. Didn't really want to be there, and definitely resented it when when the leader of our seminar said, "We don't want to be presentist, so we're not going to relate anything here to whatever just happened yesterday. We're in a seminar. This is a closed space. This is sort of a place for talking about the text." And having not read the text at that point, I was very frustrated by that. Uh-huh. And then when I did read it, when I did go to read The Origins of Totalitarianism afterwards, I expected it would have something to do with the moment. This was sort of a week when everyone was talking about resistance. David Remnick was writing in the New Yorker about the need to resist. Everyone was talking about Trump as though this sort of state of exception had occurred. I sort of read the text hoping it would be helpful, and it was not. You kind of get to a line where you're like, okay, maybe that's a little bit similar. And you'd read on for a few more sentences and the connection would totally fall apart. Mm-hmm. So then over the next 4 years, I sort of watched as every liberal commentator seemed to come to the opposite conclusion. Everyone, she was just quoted absolutely everywhere. Every major publication treated her like this sort of prophet. Mm-hmm. And treated her words like they were sort of gospel truth. So you'd have these sort of cherry-picked quotes that would essentially be in service of making pretty basic liberal points, like, it's bad that we have a president who lies to us all the time, which you don't really need Hannah Arendt's help to say.
Right.
And it started to annoy me because what I realized over the course of the administration is not just that they're misreading Hannah Arendt, which from my perspective, who cares? People misread philosophers all the time. And sometimes that's productive. But actually that it was letting people misread Trump and misread the current situation, make it more complicated than it was. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to write a piece about it. And that's the origin.
Okay. So deep with at the very beginning of the formal Trump era, the kernel was planted for this. So years in the making, and so maybe would it be possible just to give a brief capsule of who Hannah Arendt is for someone probably who maybe has heard the name but doesn't know exactly who she is? And I should say the only work of hers I've read is Eichmann in Jerusalem, and I read it almost literally 20 years ago in my freshman political science philosophy class. So I'm not versed in her work basically at all. But I do remember Eichmann in Jerusalem pretty strongly. And so who is she? Why does she matter?
Sure. So she was a German Jewish philosopher. She was studying with Martin Heidegger and had an affair with him as well. And World War II happens, Hitler comes to power, she flees Germany and comes to the US. Heidegger becomes, at the same time, a Nazi. And Heidegger, for those who don't know, is sort of this kind of giant of German philosophy. And Hannah Arendt comes over to the US. She becomes part of this New York intellectual scene. She writes for all the kind of the magazines and kind of knows all of these big mid-century names. She sort of helps to introduce European modernism in a certain way. That's not really what she's known for, but she did it. And she writes a few really big works of theory or philosophy. As she writes, The Origins of Totalitarianism is one of the things she's most famous for. It's essentially an attempt to account for the rise of Hitler. And she accounts for the rise of Hitler by tracing the quote unquote subterranean trends. Essentially what's going on under the surface of German society for the sort of 100 years preceding Hitler's rise. So she talks about anti-Semitism, not just actually in Germany. She talks all through Europe, talks about anti-Semitism. She talks about imperialism, and sort of the imperial project and how these things build the intellectual mood for something like Nazism to appeal. Mm-hmm. And then, so that's the first two chapters sections of this book are about anti-Semitism and then imperialism. And then only in the third part does she talk about totalitarianism. And because it was trendy at the time, she tried to, or not trendy, it was sort of, there was an appetite for, in the beginning of the Cold War, to knit together what had happened in Germany and what was happening in Russia. And so she brings in the Soviet Union only really in part 3 and tries to make this work account for both places where really it's mostly about Germany. So this was a masterwork. This is kind of a huge book, was received, very well. She became very famous in the US. And then went on to produce a lot more works of philosophy that are a bit denser. Mm-hmm. And she also wrote for magazines like The New Yorker, which is where she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann in Jerusalem caused a huge scandal at the time because the New Yorker sent her to Israel to cover the trial of Eichmann, who'd been extradited there or captured and sent there. And she thought it was a show trial. She thought the whole thing was BS, and was sort of appalled to see this, travesty of justice. Not that she sided with Eichmann, but she didn't think anyone was really trying to figure out what had happened. So she decided she would try to figure out actually what this phenomenon was. And she comes up with this concept of the banality of evil. The idea being that, evil is not done by people who seem to us totally monstrous. Evil is conducted by people who are not looking at the full picture, neglecting to judge whether they're doing something right or wrong, whether the systems they're helping to further are good or bad. Mm-hmm. So Eichmann designed a lot of the final solution. He's one of the kind of architects behind this, and he's just sort of like a bureaucrat. He's just sort of figuring out the best way to transport Jews. And she's sort of like, oh, this guy's not actually thinking about whether it was right or wrong. He's thinking like, what's the best way to transport people to this place?
Right. So he was sort of in charge of like the rail aspect of transporting, Jews to concentration camps. So, I mean, banality of evil is maybe her most famous coinage, and certainly people probably who don't know who she is have heard that term. But keep going, because the reaction to Eichmann spurred further work of hers.
Totally explosive reaction. Everyone, or not everyone, Jews in the US reacted really badly to Eichmann. To the point where, my Jewish grandfather was still upset that I was writing about Hannah Arendt a few years ago. But not upset, but this was his main reaction. Essentially, she had a few lines in there that I blamed certain Jewish leaders for not doing more, not fighting against for collaborating with the Nazis. And The reaction doesn't seem to me to be so much to what she said in the text, but just to the fact that she wasn't sort of towing a party line. And that's what she felt at the time too. So there were all of these rebuttals. There were kind of book-length rebuttals to what she had written, kind of totally trying to take apart every fact. And there were some errors, but she felt that she was a truth teller under siege by people who wanted to promote an official image. And yeah, I get into some of that in the article as well.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there has been like more contemporary critiques of Eichmann in Jerusalem saying that like she did get some of the stuff wrong related to how involved Eichmann actually was in like the actual extermination of Jews, how much of a committed ideological Nazi he was. Maybe these are documents that weren't available at the time. But so I think the banality of evil, as that phrase, like maybe some people think it doesn't apply to, like he's just this guy's just flat out evil, even though he's just a bland looking, bald man with glasses. Like he actually, like he knew what he was doing, and he was committed to the extermination of, European Jewry as the Nazi Party was.
Yeah. So there are a lot of factual problems in Hannah Arendt's writing, which is sort of one of the funny reasons that she became this like patron saint of fact checking over the past 4 years.
Yeah, and you start the piece by noting that she hated being fact checked by the New Yorker. I think maybe that's not super unusual. I think they're renowned for their very close, proofreading and fact checking. But she thought this was sort of she was not happy with how closely they were, picking apart what she wrote.
Yeah, and I was pretty annoyed to be fact checked on this piece too. So.
Yeah. Okay. So a comment, many writers don't like, so
yeah,
line by line and seeing what's what. But I guess it's still contested. These things that she was writing about. It was like 1962 around. Is that when the Eichmann trial was? I
don't have the date.
It's definitely in the 1960s. So there's a whole different conversation just about that. And I mean, there was a movie recently about the like how the Israelis. It wasn't extradition. It was like they kidnapped him. He was in Argentina, right? And they figured out who he was and confirmed his identity, and then like grabbed him and flew him to Israel. And so there's all these questions about like, one of the themes that I remember from the book was, what right does Israel have to be the prosecutor of this individual when like Israel didn't exist when his crimes were committed, and and they just plucked him off the street or whatever, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff in there that people still are arguing about. Okay, so one of the one of the quotes that you pull out, and this is one of the ones that circulated a lot during the past 4 years. This is Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. And so a lot of people thought that told us something about, life in 2018 in Donald Trump's America. Do you, yes or no? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's easy to read that and say, okay, the ideal subject for totalitarian rule is somebody who doesn't know how to tell the truth between truth and fiction, and that this relates to people who are unable to tell like fake news on Facebook from real news on the New York Times website or something. But it's not really what she if you actually read even that sentence kind of closely, what she's saying is the ideal subject for totalitarian rule is not somebody who, like Heidegger, her mentor, was a convinced Nazi, a guy who actually believed in the sort of philosophy of Nazism, insofar as you could call it one, right? Not someone who believes, who has faith in the ideas and can therefore question them and argue and debate about the implementation and whatever, but someone who is willing to just believe whatever the leader says. And I guess to a certain extent, you had people who were willing to believe what Trump said, but if you actually get into what she means and what she's talking about with ideology, the connection sort of falls apart and I go through this in a lot of detail in the piece. But essentially, what she's talking about with ideology is a leader who, maybe I should back up. In a totalitarian regime, the leader takes an ideology and basically creates a fictional world based on that ideology. Creates a fictional world, and then everyone in the regime, all the subjects of the totalitarian rule have to play along with the rules of this fictional world. And so does the leader. Everyone has to just has to play a game of pretend altogether. And there can be absolutely no contradiction. There's nobody inside that's contradicting it. And this is enforced by internal terror and outward aggression. And everyone is just playing along. And that we can kind of clearly see that was not the situation we had here in the United States. There were always dissenting voices. Trump never had a kind of monolithic narrative. And he didn't really have an ideology that he was using to create a kind of world of total consistency. What she talks about is, this fictional world has to be totally internally consistent, which is sort of where totalitarian regimes run into trouble, because total consistency is impossible in the actual world. Facts change, the cracks appear in the narrative. And as cracks appear in this facade, the thing that she really worries about, as cracks appear, these ideal subjects start to see that there's something not quite right, start to see that the official story is a little bit wrong. And instead of just doubting the official story, because they've so accepted it and so sort of trusted the people who've been telling them this official story, this fictional world, they lose their bearings completely and they're unable to tell truth from falsehood. Mm-hmm. Which is, we can kind of very clearly say this is not what happened. It's not like Trump had this lying world of fictional, this kind of fictional world that was totally internally consistent, and that as facts on the ground changed, people lost their faith and then didn't know what to believe. Actually, Trump is preying on the end result of that process already. He's capitalizing on the fact that there's already this big population of people in the US who didn't trust the official organs of power, of truth, mm-hmm. Didn't trust the media, the lying, didn't trust politicians. And so he's sort of taking advantage of this situation that preceded him. That may have all been very garbled, but
yes, I don't think it was garbled. I think that made sense. And part of what you talk about towards the end of the piece is the George W. Bush administration, the Iraq War, and whether that is a more appropriate sort of not parallel, but like Arendt's analysis perhaps applies to that, the situation like 2002, 2003 more than Trump. And so, so Hitler, the big lie, and I don't know if you use that term in the essay, but that's,
I do.
Okay. That's a term that has returned now in sort of a, way that I don't think makes sense. But so, Hitler said that the Jewish control had, caused the slaughter of World War I. And so, I'm probably not getting the details of what Hitler's argument was, but basically Jews control everything. And so they're going to force us into this war. And if we have to do it, then we have to do it. And then, so that wasn't true. But that was a sensible reason for, stripping Jews of their possessions and their citizenship and leading to the Holocaust. And so there's no big lie in, there's nothing comparable to that in the Trump presidency, at least up till November 6th, 2020. And after November 6th, 2020, there's, okay, so in the before period, politicians lie all the time. This is not shocking. And they lie about all sorts of things. Trump's lies were sort of different, and you characterize them as boardroom bullshit, which I think that's a good term. And so he would lie when it didn't matter. And it seemed like he sort of lied for fun. And he didn't have an overarching ideological project the way that Adolf Hitler did. The only thing he cared about was making himself look good and like get attention on television stuff, in my opinion. But so, and something that I remember reading a couple of years ago is that he's Trump has been deposed a couple times under oath, and one time he, basically a lawyer was pinning him down about numbers he had said publicly about income or on various real estate projects, and he had like inflated the numbers, but only like 30% or so. He wasn't, so back then, this is probably like the 80s or 90s, he wasn't like, Trump Plaza Hotel is the greatest thing on earth. He was like, we made like 35 million instead of 20 million. Yeah. So these are not the sorts of lies comparable to, Jews controlling world history and manipulating, European civilization. So we have to wipe them out. This is, boardroom bullshit is a good way to put it. So, Trump equals fascism has been a running debate since, 2016. And it never made sense to me because like fascism is an actual like belief system or ideology of some sort. Whereas Trump, his ideology is just, I am great. And really he had no real political project beyond that. But then once it was clear he lost the election, well, I don't know. Well, what do you think of, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the thesis of the piece in a way. I kind of have a paragraph midway through that sort of characterizes Trump's lies as boardroom bullshit and says kind of his lies weren't trying to create a fictional world so much as just inflating the numbers. All of his, how many people came to his inauguration, which was the origin of the term alternative facts. And how much money he was worth. It was all just kind of boosting the numbers. It was always about saving face. It never actually progressed to totalitarian world building in any way. But then January 6th, in a way, it's the same type of lie. It's not more people came to my inauguration than actually did. It's more people voted for me than actually did. It's the same type of lie, and yet it has this different result. And I don't know. I mean, the term big lie started being applied to Trump around then.
Yes.
And it comes from this New York Times Magazine cover story by Timothy Snyder.
Right. Who's a historian and a scientist who wrote he wrote this little like booklet, almost book, that it was a super bestseller that was like, to prevent the rise of fascism or something, and you can buy
and
it.
And it also quotes Hannah Arendt, right?
You can like buy it for like $12.99 and like put it in like a stocking stuffer kind of thing. But he was sort of an alarmist the whole time about Trump, and so I guess it's not a shock that he, was immediately left to the Hitler parallel. But the thing is, okay, so on the one hand, I objected very early on. I think I tweeted something like, this is not the big lie. Like the big lie being Jews control world history, we need to eliminate them. Like this is like sort of a small to medium lie. Like we won the election. You didn't. Like that is not, we don't need a capacious like theory of history, or like we don't need to like wipe anyone out. This is not, this is just a sort of a strict falsehood that is provable. And it's just really one guy's, personal, saving face, and that he's the best, and so he could never possibly lose. So it's not, at least early on, it's like this is just a lie, standard lie. Politicians lie all the time. It's just Trump is more shameless, and so
And Trump never takes it back, right? He never will apologize for anything. Never,
because he's right about everything, no matter what, and et cetera.
Yeah, so in a way, this was just sort of his MO. Of course, I won the election, and I'll never deny it. Same as, of course, more people came to my inauguration, and I'll never deny that. Yeah, nothing is ever his fault. He was always very poorly treated. He was treated very unfairly. I've joked before that should be on his tombstone. They treated me very unfairly. And so he's both the eternal victor and the eternal victim. I mean, the victim part perhaps has some parallels to
fascism's rise, where it's like, they stabbed me in the back, except in this case, it's Mike Pence stabbing in the back instead of the Jews stabbing the German negotiators in the back in World War I. But it's always with Trump, it's always stupider, more absurd, more like sort of grotesque, and just dumber all around than what happened, more farcical than what happened in world history before Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, January 6th, I think was scary because it revealed the fact that these people, that there was this population, this group that was living in a kind of dream world that thought it would do anything to like walk into the Capitol and hang out for a while and make a mess and scare everybody. But there was no plan for an actual coup. If you wanted to organize a coup, if Trump had wanted to go and be some sort of totalitarian, he probably, he could have spent the entirety of his administration laying the groundwork, making nice with all of the generals.
He's far too lazy and stupid to successfully or even try something like that. I mean, he during the period between November 6th and January or whatever, the election day of January 6th, like he was golfing, once a week or something. Like this was not like poring over the maps and so forth, trying to figure out like how we can seize the regional capitals.
He doesn't want power. He doesn't ultimately.
He wants attention. Yeah. Okay, I think we're on the same page about that. Yeah.
Yeah. He wants people to think he won the election. He doesn't actually want to have to organize a coup. He doesn't want to be known as someone who had to organize a coup.
Yeah. I mean, but also organize a coup, that's a lot of work. I mean, you got to like the military has to be on your side, a lot of organization, waking up.
I'd say it's not so much work as strategy. He shoots from the hip. And his lies are also, I mean, this is why the kind of Arendt thing is a total allows for a total mischaracterization of his lies, because he's not planning out what lies would be strategic to tell to serve the ultimate aim. He's just lying.
Yeah, he's just saying whatever,
making up as they go along, as he goes along.
In the moment, whatever he needs to get people to pay attention to him. And there's this thing that he said at some point that got repeated often, which was like, he realized early on when he was doing his rallies that he could look at the cameras and see the red dots for when that meant he was streaming live. And so he could tell when the red dots turned off, that means the cable news networks were not carrying it live. And so he would say something crazy, and then they would like break in again and be like, oh, Trump says that, Hillary Clinton ate an elephant. And then they're like, that's, and then CNN covers that again. So, I mean, one of his talents is really for grabbing attention and manipulating the media in this very stupid way. But yeah, so it was never like January 6th could never succeed in any sort of traditional way that a coup could, because the military wasn't like, you have to have the military for a coup to work, because the military can just step in and take power. And also it was just so disorganized. There, like some people had some sort of plan, but it wasn't a plan that would result in Trump staying in power. It's possible that their plan could have resulted in like senators or congressmen being killed or something, or kidnapped, but
all sorts of yeah.
But it wasn't like an actual threat to like whatever happened on that day. It could have been 10 times worse, I think. Maybe if they had blown up the entire building or something. But I mean, I remember when it was happening, I was thinking they're going to start setting fires inside the building, and then that's going to be really bad. But that didn't happen because I mean, like they didn't want to do that, or just like it wasn't. So many people were just there, sort of taking selfies and hanging out and live streaming and so forth. So it was like it's this very postmodern farcical event, in my opinion, but like still a serious thing. But then, okay, so I'm on board with you, I think, largely for your thesis, and maybe even after January 6th. But then things have been changing over the past couple months, because the lie is getting bigger. It seems to me, because more and more people have to pretend. If you're a GOP like official, probably, unless you are like nuts, that he did, like there wasn't a massive fraud. No states are going to be overturned. He's not going to be appointed. Like, the MyPillow guy thinks that like on some day Trump is going to it's going to either become president once again, or it's going to be revealed he was president the whole time. So if you are not a crazy person, you understand that isn't true and that these are all lies. But you have to pretend, because they're all scared of Trump turning against them. And I mean, he can't send an angry tweet anymore, but he can say like, Liz Cheney you turned on me and I hate you. And so she loses her positions of power within the party. And so they all have to, like the entire GOP basically at this point is committed to keeping this false narrative going, even though 98% of them know that this is false. And it's all to flatter the absurd, thoughts of this demented sociopath who was president for 4 years. Maybe I overstate that a little bit, but I think that's basically true. Are things of the past couple months, changed any of your thoughts about this?
I don't know. I think, we have no idea what's going to happen. I don't think we can really use our kind of analysis of Trump's lies to figure out what's going to happen. It could be dangerous. It always could, the situation could get very dangerous. If Trump were younger, I would be more scared about it.
Yeah, hopefully, the best thing for everyone would be if he just croaks and then his accursed existence on this planet is over, and then it's not like Donald Jr. can pick up the torch because he's just a dummy. So, and it doesn't seem like there's anyone who's well positioned as a successor. I agree with that. Yeah,
it very much is around Donald Trump.
It's a sort of cult of personality, but much more pathetic. And so there's a lot of people who are talking now about Trumpism without Trump and who could possibly lead this movement. Could it be Ivanka? Could it be JD Vance or something? But there is no Trumpism without Trump. There's just ism, and then but there is no Trump policy.
It's just ego. It's not ideology.
Yeah, it's just he's the best, and so once he's dead, which will happen at some point, inshallah, then there's nothing left, and so maybe the GOP becomes more immigration restrictionist and more sort of xenophobic towards people crossing the border to work or something. But the essential Trump charismatic kookiness is not going to be replicated by anyone else, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I'm not sure. I'm not not to use Hannah Arendt as gospel at all, but the note I end on in the piece and one of her big points is that we shouldn't. She's very skeptical about predictions, right. And especially about using what's happened in the past to try to predict the future. And I'm always a little wary about predictions myself. Maybe not because Hannah Arendt tells me to be, but it did seem like a good way to end the piece.
Right.
I don't know what's going to happen next.
I don't either. I'm almost, it's, Hannah Arendt maybe wouldn't have been suited for the Twitter era, where if you state something definitively, then that's a good way to get retweets, and saying, well, I don't know what's going to happen. No one is going to retweet that. Probably. But I'd just be pretty confident that he's not even going to run in 2024. He'd much rather play this sort of kingmaker role, even though he's not doing a very good job of it. I just saw that yesterday there was a special election, and the candidate he endorsed in some Texas race, the person died or something, lost. So he can't even command a Texas primary election at this point. So his power is, I think, a lot of it is sort of illusory. So he really is sort of a paper tiger right now. So one thing I was thinking about is going back to the banality of evil.
Sure.
Is that Trump is not, whatever he is not a banal person. And a lot of the people, there were some people who were sort of bland bureaucrats who were carrying out bad things that Trump did, like at the border, and separating migrant children from their parents, that kind of thing. But also a lot of the it was sort of the grotesquerie of evil or something, or grotesquerie of Trumpism. You had all these strange people like Sebastian Gorka and Omarosa and Trump himself, who cakes himself in orange makeup, and this is not. So this is not some boring guy. This is a freak show. And so obviously no one really saw Trump coming, and whether he's evil or not is I don't know how to categorize that, but it was kookiness, craziness, stupidity, not just bland, the bland bureaucrat sending the trains to the concentration camp.
Yeah. I mean, Hitler wasn't really banal either. Excuse me. Right. I don't think banality of evil can be really a catch-all term. I think it, if you sort of extend it a bit and maybe forget about the term evil, because evil is a complicated thing, but one of the things we should look to in American government is sort of the continuity between what Trump was doing at the border and what Obama was doing at the border, and what various bureaucrats have been doing at the border, or in lots of parts of the country for many years. I think that's more the kind of banality of evil than Trump saying an outlandish thing. There's, in a way, sort of the most outlandish characters in the Trump administration were pretty harmless. Like Omarosa, I don't think she did anything evil, did she? I'm not sure. Doubt it.
I mean, in fact, she's probably in the upper, 20% in terms of like how bad the various people were. I mean, so the person who comes to mind of sort of the banality of evil, it would be Stephen Miller, who was also this sort of bald guy wearing a suit. I guess he looks somewhat creepy and vampiric, but not a sort of over the top guy. And Miller was sort of the only person at that level in the White House who wasn't totally incompetent and a moron. And so he was able to effectuate his policy in terms of immigration very effectively. And, but yeah, he wasn't, he became, I mean, like everyone knew who he was. So it wasn't sort of just like the anonymous bureaucrat sort of thing, but yeah, he's somewhere, I don't know, he's somewhere in between, and certainly seems like a
but I don't think the banality of evil needs to be I don't think the banal figure needs to be anonymous. Okay. Eichmann wasn't, right?
I mean, I guess not. I mean, was he at the Wannsee conference or whatever?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was up there. I don't know. Yeah,
he was in the higher, pretty high.
He wasn't your Goering or your Goebbels or whatever, but he was, I guess, the next level down. But sort of, the blandness. I don't know.
All the figures Trump tended to replace colorful figures with bland ones because the bland ones were actually better for him. Steve Bannon didn't last very long in that administration.
Right.
He wasn't banal enough.
Yeah, over the top. I mean, Trump, he was the only one you couldn't he couldn't fire himself. And so he was the overtop incompetent one. And these sort of reality TV show, literal or figurative type characters who he surrounded himself with, most of them ended up resigning or being fired or something. And then there were some, sort of standard GOP types who replaced him. Like maybe Bill Barr would be, we could look at him in sort of this realm. Like he was attorney general already, this sort of like boring, bespectacled owlish figure who sort of presented himself as just sort of like, well, I'm just doing what needs to be done. And but he was a much more effective attorney general than what's his name, the Alabama senator who pissed Trump off and got fired. I mean, it's a resonant term and people continue to think about it, but it's not easy to apply it.
It maybe is a bit easier to apply to sort of something like the Department of Defense or sort of, the American military, right? You've got people whose names we've never heard, who are making a lot of decisions overseas, or even, the CIA, or a lot of people who are sort of working their way up this ladder and quietly furthering their own careers by killing a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, maybe closer. Yeah,
maybe the guy, was his name Esper? He's so boring, I can't even remember his name. The guy who was defense secretary, and then he came from, he was like from Boeing or Raytheon or something, and he also sort of seemed like a bland sort of white guy, and then he was the defense secretary, and because he wasn't attracting attention in the way some of these other characters were, people were maybe I'm sure he was able to get away with some stuff that a more bombastic type of person wouldn't have been able to do. The fact that I can't even remember what his name was is sort of
you're right, though. He was
indicative of that he, if he showed me his picture I probably would recognize who this guy was, even though he was like defense secretary for 2 years. Okay, so you sort of end the piece with talking about Iraq, and can you talk about why you decided to talk about that towards the end?
Yeah. So I sort of get into it by talking about the Pentagon Papers. And Hannah Arendt wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books about the Pentagon Papers and how she wanted to call all of the guys who had carried out the war in Vietnam problem solvers. She thought that, kind of like Eichmann, they were not saying, okay, are we doing the right thing in Vietnam? Are we even winning any like material gains? They were just like the only goal of the war in Vietnam, she says, is making sure the US is perceived as the most powerful nation on earth. Mm-hmm. The image of the US is the whole goal. That there is no sort of actual goal to which image making is the proximate goal. And she's very critical of these guys who are sort of killing lots of people in the name of, or, you know, in the service of an image, without really considering the ethics. And so the Pentagon Papers reveal a few things. One is they sort of reveal all of these motives and all of what's gone on, but then they also reveal, she thinks they're not all that revelatory. And this is something that people dispute. People think she's wrong about this. But regardless, she says, what they actually reveal is that the press has done a pretty good job, because we've known much of what's revealed in these papers all along. Mm-hmm. So the US, the official story never had the chance to become monolithic, never had the chance to become kind of a totalitarian style image, mm-hmm. Because the press has always been questioning it. So she has this whole thing. And then we get to the Iraq War, and the contrast between Iraq and Vietnam is largely that the press did not serve that function, did not make sure, did not question what the Bush administration was saying, often sort of just repeated it. Even people on the pretty far left press were sort of gullible and allowed that image to become monolithic, so that when, after the fact, there were more questions and it was revealed that the American government had been lying and there are all these lies that were used to justify the Iraq War, it was easy for people, following Arendt's logic, it was easy to lose faith in the official story. It was easy to lose faith in both the media, who failed to do their job, and in the government, which lied to us.
Yeah.
So I think, I didn't mean to kind of pin things too specifically on the Iraq War. It's just kind of a good example of what seems to me to be a pattern in American politics or and media that's been slowly building maybe since the Pentagon Papers in Vietnam, just that the government lies to us, and we sort of know the government is lying to us, and we also know that the media is only questioning the government part of the time, and that there is, to some extent, that we have good reason to be skeptical of the official organs of truth-telling, the official story. So I kind of went off of something that Arendt's former assistant said during the Iraq War, calling back to her theories and calling back to what she said about the Pentagon, about Vietnam, and thought, actually, that is a good explanation, maybe, for why people are so skeptical now, or why people are willing to believe somebody like Trump, or don't really care if he's telling them the truth or not. Because they sort of, people would always say that Trump was saying the quiet part out loud. The quiet part, which means that we already sort of know that politicians are lying to us all the time. He was in a way not lying better than they were or lying more. He was lying badly. So I sort of wanted to use the Iraq War to question whether post-truth was something new. Like, what is new about post-truth, or why is this the post-truth era if we've been lied to consistently for a long time?
Right. And so the period from 9/11 to like a couple months after the Iraq invasion is more comparable to a sort of totalitarian, merging of like state and press and all following the same line than the Trump era, where the press was consistently opposed to everything Trump did. And I mean, like Trump did. I mean, Trump talked constantly, and sometimes he did say things that were true and that no one else could say, at least in the GOP. So one of those things was during some debate, Trump was insulting George W. Bush, and Jeb Bush said, "Well, my brother, he kept us safe." And then Trump said, "No, he didn't. 9/11 happened." And so that no one else could have done that. And that actually is true. Like George Bush did not keep us safe because 9/11 happened on his watch. So he was able to, like, as a, inveterate taboo breaker, he was able to break some of the GOP taboos. And that probably attracted some people, like some primary voters who were like, wow, this guy does call it like it is, because he's not afraid to violate the, sacred, go along with the party line on this sort of stuff in the way that the rest of, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz would have never said something like that. And so that was part of his appeal. And yeah, I mean, there's an argument that if the Iraq war had never happened, then there's no way Trump would have been able to attain power, because, the GOP was so discredited, and also the instability in the Middle East fueled this refugee surge from people in the Middle East to Europe, and that sort of added to the hysteria around like immigrants coming to murder us and so forth. And yeah, so I think that is, the counterfactual, you could think about it and ponder whether, no Iraq war, no President Trump ever, but it would have even been considered.
Yeah.
So is it sort of, are you ending saying sort of like, in some way, the what happened during the Bush administration did sort of like prime the populace to be in that like state of uncertainty about truth and falsehood, or at least some part of the populace, and then Trump comes in and takes advantage of that? Or
maybe. No, I mean, I think that's true. I think sort of the way I thought about structuring the piece was like, well, everyone is treating Hannah Arendt as gospel truth, and as a perfect reflection of Trump. And so, first of all, like, she doesn't apply to Trump; she's irrelevant to Trump. And then, second of all, even if she is irrelevant to Trump, let's take her as gospel. If she's right about this phenomenon about truth and lies, if we actually think this is correct, and this is how people in a population in a state get to the point where they aren't able to recognize the difference between truth and lies, and if that is the situation we're in, then the person she's blaming for that is not Trump, but like every presidential administration that preceded him. Mm-hmm. And the Bush administration is a good example of that. So it's sort of, it's more kind of a rhetorical move, I guess, than like a statement of absolute truth. I'm not sure. I think these things are complicated. I think there are a lot of reasons why people are willing to believe Donald Trump, or a lot of things that can account for his popularity that are outside of the Iraq War and outside of governmental truth telling. There's also sort of reality TV. There's also celebrity. There's also the internet. There's kind of all of these other factors, and I don't think I can make as simple a causal argument. It's too complicated.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's anything in Arendt that applies to sort of QAnon and this dream world that some number of our fellow Americans entered into over the past couple of years?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, if you want to use, it's sort of the same thing, which is that people who have lost their confidence, who feel this wobbling feeling that results from believing an official story and then watching cracks develop. I was kind of walking through that earlier in more detail. People like that are susceptible to conspiracies. And the other thing she says that is relevant is she blames loneliness, social atomization for this. Mm-hmm. She thinks people, and I'm not sure this is true or not, but she thinks that people who are lonely are susceptible to conspiracies. People who are atomized, people who've sort of lost their place in a community, find a home through a conspiracy, through a movement that gives meaning to their lives. The modern world, she thinks, is there's so much arbitrariness, there's so much randomness, there's it's so easy to feel out of place. And if you believe in an ideology or a conspiracy, you get a home.
Right.
You like find a community, you find a simpler and more consistent way of looking at the world and your place in it. Lonely people want consistency, is her sort of insight there. And I think that is true.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And then, people, once you're sort of halfway into QAnon or some other similar thing, you end up sort of driving away people who are in your real life because you're talking about like Tom Hanks being a pedophile. Yeah. And then so you get even like lonelier in real life and more deeper into this, network of people believing in conspiracies and stuff. Yeah. Do you have you ever seen The Fog of War, the documentary about Robert McNamara?
Yeah.
Think about him as sort of a banal type figure, and he was sort of brought in. I think he was like the president of Ford Motor Company originally before he was Secretary of Defense, and he was sort of like the numbers guy, and so he was like, we're bringing it. So it was sort of almost, he was like a wonk kind of, and
he's exactly who she's talking about in the New York Review books. He says like I think his name is in there somewhere. She's talking about
because he was the defense secretary for Johnson, then it would make sense that the Pentagon Papers analysis would talk about him. But
I just couldn't remember if she called him a problem solver directly. I think she did. But he's the prototype of a problem solver.
Yeah.
Keep going. Don't worry.
Yeah, sort of like he he doesn't have his own ideology. He's just like, look at you running the numbers and like we'll figure out what the best thing is, and like so that meant like more and more bombs being dropped in Vietnam and Cambodia and so forth. And then it is interesting to think about Rumsfeld, who also had a documentary made about him by the same filmmaker, and who just died a month or so ago, and how he fits in this. But maybe we're moving somewhat beyond the ambit of your essay. Is there anything else you want to say about it before we maybe wrap up?
I don't think I have any. I think those are both kind of great examples of what she was talking about. And also great examples of why people don't trust the U.S. government.
Right. And, when I was reading the obituaries of Rumsfeld, there was a part of his life that I didn't know anything about, which he was like, so he was also defense secretary twice, but after in the Ford administration, then when he left, he like entered corporate life and was like a hugely successful CEO and became super rich, like running like pharmaceutical companies or something. And it was sort of that like, he could like look at the problem and solve it by looking at the numbers and so forth. And then he like went back into government service and then, helped cause this giant catastrophe for humanity, the Iraq War.
I mean, both of those documentaries, those are both like Errol Morris documentaries. They're both great.
Oh yeah, I said Alice Gibney, but it's Errol Morris. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're both Errol Morris. It's like The Fog of War and the Known Unknown or Known Unknown.
Something with unknown, known unknowns. Yeah, known unknowns. Yeah.
And they're both kind of perfect examples of, I think, what Hannah Arendt would have liked the Israeli government to do with Eichmann. Because they both sort of, I think what they're both doing is sort of drawing out the banality of evil. They're both trying to dissect what makes a person who's essentially interested in logistics and tactics and strategy do things that are very evil and have huge humanitarian consequences without really like thinking about what those consequences are, just thinking about the strategy.
Yeah. So these types are still among us, and probably some of them we've never even heard of are, machinating or whatever in some mid-level position in the U.S. government right now. So the piece is in Harper's, Men in Dark Times. We'll link to it. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the drift?
Sure. And
plug that, or tell us what that is. And
I'd love to. You should go to thedriftmag.com, which maybe could also be included in if there's room for more than one link. I don't know.
Yeah, so then we'll include the link to that.
We're a quarterly magazine. We launched a year ago, and we publish long-form cultural, political criticism. We, as well as poetry and fiction and more fun stuff. If you enjoy my piece in Harper's, it's kind of a similar mentality over at the Drift. We aim to publish new writers who haven't gotten a lot of exposure and who haven't necessarily gotten a chance to publish in big places. Please read us and please pitch us. We respond to every pitch that we receive. We're like interested in publishing people who have not sort of been absorbed into the media Twitter sphere where everyone can too often seem like they're saying the same thing. The magazine very much came out of our sense. I started it with a friend and then some other friends have come on. It came out of our sense that at the beginning of the Trump administration and then during Me Too, to just repeat myself, a sort of monolithic media narrative was emerging, and that even the left media wasn't really dissenting enough. Mm-hmm. And that there was more dissent in podcasts than was available in the sort of intellectual magazines, and we didn't like that. So we thought we'd try something new. And please read us and subscribe.
That's interesting. So if people want to pitch, how can they do so?
Email us, editors@thedriftmag.com. It's all available on our website. And you can also subscribe, which really helps because we're a new small organization and all the money is basically just going to supporting young writers. And they can also donate, or we just launched our store last week, so they can also buy cool merch. They can buy a t-shirt with Eugene Debs' face on it. They can buy, which is that's selling out. So that if they want to buy it, they should buy it soon. They can buy all, tote bags and hats, and please do. We're basically just trying to support young writers and help them bring new perspectives into the broader conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you saw more sort of diversity of opinion or something in podcasts than in other things. And then maybe that's related to like the fact that, what's rewarded on social media is like either going along with what everyone is saying or like totally rejecting what everyone is saying and, making them out to be the morons. And whereas podcast, both it's harder for a podcast to go viral and like it sort of inherently has a like conversational dialectical or something.
I think that's true. In a podcast, like you have to listen all the way through. You can't sort of screenshot one line or quote one line. You can't skim for the most sensational part and cancel someone on the basis of it. You have to actually listen to an hour to find the spicy thing.
If you want to cancel someone who's on a podcast, you have to listen to the whole thing. You can't just do like Control F and looking for like a bad word they said or something.
Totally, it takes a long time. And I think part of what we were thinking is that pieces in all of the little magazines read differently if you're on Twitter and not. Which is a problem, right? You're kind of, if you read a piece and you're on Twitter, you're able to read between the lines and see all of these things that are just not accessible to you if you're not part of the discourse online. And we hated that. We think that's bad. So their pieces read the same either way. We try to really avoid that. And we try to make sure we're not only catering to this sort of like the sort of wave of what gets supported online, and sort of we don't want to just gang up on things that everyone thinks are bad. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to support the things that everyone thinks are good just because everyone's supporting them. Mm-hmm.
Well, that all sounds admirable to me. So people should check that out. And I wish you the best in that endeavor. So, so if people want to follow, even though we're just talking about how stupid Twitter is and how it is baleful for the discourse, do you want to plug your Twitter account?
The Drift Mag. You
And what
can,
about
yeah.
and what if people want to just follow you in particular? Where can they do so?
Me in particular. I think my Twitter handle is Panovka, but I'm not totally sure if that's true. Fake news over here. I think that's true.
Well,
yeah, it is Panovka. Please
okay,
follow
if you don't even know your own Twitter handle, then you're either doing something wrong or right, I guess, about how the discourse is, unfolds in usually bad ways.
There are very few Panovkas, so I think people can find me.
Okay. Yeah, and so all the links to these things will be on the Plug-in site if people want to check them out. So thank you for coming on. This is an interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks so much.